I will start. Tell it not to display your screen. It turns off the projector, so it's just going to take a minute to reboot here. But that's perfect, because I like to start the beginning of class with a little bit of a refresher of what we ended last class with. Before that, did anybody come up with any questions, things they wanted to know about after last class? Hopefully you were all able to. You might notice that there. It doesn't indicate if it's booting up or not, so I'm going to leave it because I tend to keep pushing the button when I shouldn't. But I will start off with that refresher from the end of last time. We had started talking about different kinds of research. We talked about basic research versus applied research, and then we had sort of a third intermediate type that was that translational research that bridges the gap between the two. So as a reminder, our basic research was doing research for the sake of research. You're seeking knowledge to learn about a topic. So maybe I want to study these, and I can learn these, and I can learn. That would be basic. Whereas applied research is trying to solve a problem. So with applied research, you come into it with an idea of a goal you want to achieve, a problem you want to solve, and you're going to do research that hopefully gets you to a solution for that problem. You want to apply what you learn to solve the problem. And of course, in practice, we run into that translational research fairly often. And that's because it's fairly common for us to learn something through basic research and think, hey, this would actually be really useful in this situation. All right. Translational research is what happens when our basic research output ends up being useful in an applied situation. And as I mentioned, sometimes different people will use different terms, so you might not see it as basic and applied, or some places don't include translational. But for this course, those are the terms we're going to use, and hopefully now that you understand what they mean, you'll kind of recognize them when you see them out. And so this is just a little bit of a visual representation of how all the different kinds of research can sort of move around, how they can inform or affect other areas. So it's not just the research itself, basic or applied, which can actually influence each other, but you also have things like applied practice. So once you start putting things into use, say as an instructor, I find that somebody did some basic research and they figured out, hey, students learn really well when they're asked application questions. So maybe I start using that, I can apply that knowledge in practice. So that's where that comes in. There's also a separate little thing for clinical research and practice because clinical stuff kind of has its own little way of working. You'll find that a lot of psychology, though everybody thinks of psychology in general as clinical psychology, not all of psychology does clinical stuff. So I've never actually worked with humans, so I can't really attest to that side of it. And I don't work with disorders or anything like that, so clinical psychology is its own little bubble. And you'll usually find that in your courses, so if you take clinical psychology as a class, that's going to deal with very different things, but still using the same principles that we establish in basic introductory psychology. All right. Is that a little bit too bright? Oh, actually, question first. Usually, but not always. Sometimes I find a lot of basic is we come into something and we know that we know so little that we just start looking for whatever we can. So maybe there's a new kind of psychological disorder and we know nothing about it. So maybe we're going to shoot in the dark and say, okay, let's do a correlational study and see if there are risk factors that we can find that relate to this. So it might translate to being applied, but at the beginning we have no idea. Yeah. And for my questions, like in practice, it gets very murky what it falls into cleanly, but for my example questions, I'll usually make it like very apparent. So if I talk about solving a specific problem, then you know it's applied. And if I talk about we want to learn about a thing, then it's basic. Those are usually the indicators. All right. So back to the question, is this too bright? Should I try and figure out how to turn off the front lights, or are we good with this? We're good with this? Yeah? Okay. I'm still getting used to all my class setups, so we'll figure things out. If you make it too dark, then people get tired. So now we're going to move from sort of our basic establishing some terminology and sort of getting a feel for science in general, and we're going to move into everybody's favorite part, an intro course, and that's the history. And I promise I try and keep the history as brief as possible, and I did warn you last time, and I'll say it one more time because this is going to be a very name and date heavy lecture. I don't like testing on names or dates. I will include names and or dates in a question, but not as the only piece of information that you have to solve that question. So for my example, I always use something like, Wilhelm Wundt was the founder of structuralism. What would he think of this situation? So I've given you a name as well as a field, as opposed to just saying what field is Wundt associated with and kind of give you both pieces. And that's just because I like to stay away from those memorization questions. Same with dates. I don't feel that they're super important. In the real world, you can look those up. So I'd much rather test how you apply that information and how you use it, as opposed to if you can memorize a bunch of names and dates. And it may or may not be driven entirely by my inability to remember names and or dates. But fair is fair. So we mentioned last class that psychology as a field is very, very recent, but that psychology-like ideas are fairly old. So if we look at psychology-like ideas, we can go back to ancient Greek philosophers. But more recent history and the stuff that we'll get into sort of later today and into Friday, we'll be looking at things in sort of the 1870s onwards as modern history when psychology became a field. Before that, we're actually looking at philosophy and physiology. So looking at how the body works and then thinking about how the mind works, which is kind of interesting. So philosophers would ask questions about the mind. What is the nature of the mind? How does the mind work? So famous names like Plato and Aristotle, they were talking about the mind many, many centuries ago. In terms of physiologists, there was actually a lot more discussion of what we call mental disorders or psychological disorders nowadays. They were talked about quite a bit earlier than I might have realized, and probably you guys too. But physiologists were detailing the anatomy of the brain, and we have one, I'm probably going to say it fairly wrong, but Ali ibn Abasa al-Mujasi. There we go. And this is a Persian physician who was one of the first people documented trying to explain psychological disorders as illnesses, as opposed to demonic possession or something like that. They actually had a concrete scientific explanation that they were trying to give for different kind of psychological disorders, and they did this in 1900 AD, which is so much earlier than I thought that we'd see things like that. And that kind of brings to attention some of the limitations that I try to point out, which is that a lot of psychology texts, and therefore a lot of psychology classes in North America, are very North American centric. And by North American centric, I mean you're only ever going to see anything about America. I try and introduce Canadian figures, and I've been trying to go more afield with stuff like that. But it's actually very hard as a North American academic to find anything other than North American individuals. So I give this little bit of a disclaimer that you're going to see a lot of old white men in a lot of these slides, and that's not because they're the only people that did this. but it's what North American psychology focuses on because that's all they seem to care about. So it's a pretty intense limitation, but it is what's in our textbook. So hopefully bringing your attention to that makes you think a little bit more critically about it. All right, so we're going to move a little bit more modern. We're going to stick around the sort of 1500s, 1600s, and we're going to look at one of the problems that is very central to psychology as a field. And this is famously called the mind-body problem. So if you remember back to our discussion of what psychology is, we talked about psychology as a scientific study of both behavior and the mind. And then we kind of mentioned that it's a little bit problematic because behavior is stuff that we can mostly observe. We did lump in some unobservable stuff as well, but the mind itself is almost entirely unobservable as we think of it. We think of the mind as a fairly abstract thought, and that causes problems if you're trying to study behavior and the mind. And so this was discovered fairly early, well before psychology was a field, but it was looked at by theorists who wondered how we might learn about the mind or if it was even possible to learn about the mind. And that's our mind-body problem, which is what is the relationship between the physical body and the behavior that we produce and that abstract mind? How do they relate, or do they relate? And so we're going to start seeing sort of conflicting and balanced perspectives on different ideas. You'll find a lot of pairs of perspectives or things that rise from one idea and somebody proposes the opposite. And we're going to go back and forth quite a bit. And I find it actually helps that most of these ideas rise in contrast and actually in conflict with what was the previously accepted view. And so the first that we see of these is the difference between dualism and monism. So dualism, or fully called the mind-body dualism, is this idea that the mind and the body are two separate entities. So they are dual entities that exist in two very different ways. The idea is that our body is physical and measurable, and our mind is something sort of unmaterial and unmanageable and other. They didn't necessarily agree on what other the mind might be, but this perspective would argue that because the mind was different, it was separate, and it wasn't material and measurable like the body, that there's no way that we can study it. And so one of the most famous of the dualists is René Descartes. So he was a French philosopher in the late 1500s into the 1600s, and he was also a mathematician. So this is actually who you can blame for inventing analytic geometry. He joined the fields of geometry and algebra into analytic geometry, so that's all his fault. But he also had a lot of thoughts about how we think and how we interact with the world. So he argued that because our mind is inherently immaterial, it is therefore unknowable. And he went so far as to say that if we want to, well, there's no point in trying to study the mind, because no matter how hard we study the body, we'll never know anything about the mind. And as a field that studies behavior and the mind, that's really problematic for the existence of psychology. Psychology can't exist if we can't study that whole big part of what psychology is. So dualism isn't really compatible with how we want to look at both the physical and whatever the mind happens to be. And for Descartes' theory, this is kind of one of those interesting ones. If you can find a short YouTube video on it, I always find it interesting to watch. Not because I ever test on it, but because it's so absurd, the way that he thought things worked. Just a little aside is that he thought that the mind and the body would interact by the pineal gland. So it's a central gland sort of in the middle of your brain, at the base or sort of the top of your spinal cord there. And he picked that because it's one of the very few structures in the brain that isn't mirrored. It's just a single structure in the center as opposed to having two hemispheres. And he argued that that's exactly where you'd expect to find something that could lean one way or the other to control how you move. And what was the pineal gland directing? Animal spirits that worked like hydraulics would work. So he had watched hydraulics move sort of mechanisms where if you applied pressure here, it led to movement there. And so he said, well, that must be what's happening in our bodies. There's some kind of movement of pressure with these spirits, and the pineal gland into different parts of the body so that we can move as we move. And so clearly that's not what was going on, but it was a good start in trying to figure out what might happen. And so, okay, well, if dualism is incompatible with studying psychology as we've defined it, then we want to switch over and talk about the alternative that was proposed instead. And this is where monism comes into play. And our famous figure here is Thomas Hobbes. And so monism is the belief that the mind and the body are one. They're not two separate entities, one material and one immaterial. They're both the same thing. And specifically, we can talk about materialistic monism, where we think that the body and the mind are both physical. There's also another branch that is immaterial monism, where you assume that everything is immaterial. But most people in psychology would bias towards the material side of things. And the way I've had this explained, and the way that I've related most to it, is, okay, so let's consider the mind not as its own entity. Let's consider the mind using an analogy. So think about weather. We can talk about the weather. We can say that it's sunny outside, or today it's raining. So that is the weather today. But there is no single entity that we can point to and say this is weather. Weather is more of a descriptor of what's happening as opposed to a specific object or item that we can find. So if we think about the mind as not so much a specific tangible thing, but maybe the mind is the way that we describe what's happening in our brains. So the mind isn't like a physical thing that we can touch, but it's a way that we can think about how our brains think and how our neurons fire and how they work together. So in that way, the mind isn't something separate and unknowable. It's just how we describe the physical stuff that's going on in our brains. And that's an easier way, at least for me, to grasp this idea of monism, where the mind isn't something separate and special. It's just what's happening in our brains, and that's how we talk about it. Yeah, so dualists would say the mind is irrelevant, we can't know anything about it, ignore it. Let's focus on the physical. We can look at behaviors, we can look at like what's in our body and what's happening, but we will never understand how the mind works, so we won't even try. And then monism is saying, no, it's all the same. So if you study the body, and if you study behavior, and if you study what's going on internally, you're going to learn about what's going on mentally as well, because they're directly related. Kind of clears it up, yeah? Awesome. Yeah, it's really hard. We start off with like deep philosophical questions that have been debated since like Aristotle. So yeah, we're just going to cover that in 2 slides and move on. But with our famous face here, Thomas Hobbes, he said that our mental events, or the things we think of as thoughts, our mind, are actually just products of physical events. The neurons firing in our brains. That's what it is. And this is, as I said, essential for psychology, because otherwise we'd be ignoring a big chunk about what psychology is set up to study. So they're saying, yeah, no, we can study the mind by measuring physical processes. Don't worry about it. So we stick with a more monistic point of view. We're also going to take a brief interlude into British empiricism. And British empiricism is actually going to be a nice bridge between sort of the older ideas. And then when we get into behaviorism, this is kind of like the prequel to behaviorism. But we don't talk about behaviorism for a couple of slides. It's just really hard to fit it in. But British empiricism came out of our monism and dualism debate, and that sort of idea of, well, what about the mind? How's the mind happening? And we care about British empiricism because they focused on that empirical side of things. They argued that all ideas, all knowledge that we gain is gained empirically. So we learn through our senses. We learn through interacting with our environment. And so that's starting to put us on a route of not so much philosophical debate, but now we're starting to think about sort of concrete scientific thinking, which is a little bit closer to where we want to be. And so they were focusing more on observation, things that you could observe and document and measure, and they wanted to get away from that philosophical reasoning and debate side of things that was so prevalent before this. And they argued that reason has the potential for error. If you think around or if you sit around and think about how you think, that isn't necessarily very scientific or accurate. But if you observe things that you can relate to what people are thinking or how they're thinking, that's a little bit more concrete. And so John Locke is our famous British empiricist there, and he wanted philosophy, our sort of pre-psychology state, to start focusing on the capabilities and the extent of the human mind. So what can the mind do? How much can it do? What is it capable of? And they wanted to figure that out by sort of empirically studying things, by observing and documenting things. So we're moving a little bit more towards that scientific standard that we want. And we'll come back to the empiricists very briefly as we transition into a different modern school of thought. But first, we're going to detour into modern history and talk about the first psychology laboratory that was ever established. So from the sort of North American, European-centric perspective, we have Wilhelm Wundt recognized as the father of modern psychology. And that's because he established the first recognized psychology laboratory in the University of Leipzig in Germany in 1879. So fairly recently in terms of history, especially if you think about something like when was physics established or mathematics. Those have a much longer history. That's kind of what I meant about psychology being fairly recent in practice, but the ideas have stretched back further. And one of Wundt's biggest concerns was sticking to that scientific perspective, using that empiricism and focusing on scientific techniques to try and study the mind. So his major goal was trying to make psychology an independent and well-respected field. And so if you've ever taken classes outside of psychology, maybe you've interacted with physics or mathematics or chemistry, there's a little bit of a hierarchy within the sciences. As somebody who started in physics and then moved into bio and befriended a lot of chemistry majors, there's a really different perspective on which is the most valid form of science. So usually people think of mathematics and then physics being applied math, and then chemistry being applied physics, and so on and so forth. And psychology, to many people, sits fairly low on that ladder, on that hierarchy, which is fairly unfortunate because it's a fairly new field. And though we'll talk about a couple of perspectives and individuals who had very non-scientific views, a lot of the push to get psychology made and to get it moving was driven to try and make it a respectable science. So there's a little bit of public perception there that isn't necessarily well-deserved, but I try and remind people that it is a very, very new field comparatively. And so once this one laboratory had been set up, Wundt had a bunch of undergraduates and graduate students who he would talk with and train, and then would send off into the world to establish their own labs. So his graduates set up programs of new labs across Europe and North America. And so I have an interesting graph, again, just for interest's sake, as opposed to actually asking you about where or when any of these happened. But this is, again, a good illustration of North American psychology being very American-centric. We do get Toronto on the map, which is sort of one Canadian inclusion. And I try and do my own Canadian inclusions as time goes on. But yeah, there are quite a few of these labs established, and all from students of one. So that's where this all started and then spread to North America. And so between 1883 and 1893, so only in 10 years, there were 23 new laboratories established in North America, which is pretty darn cool. They moved fast. All right, so continuing with Wundt and his students, we're going to come into our next duality, our two constricting and contrasting fields. And we're going to talk about the idea of structuralism versus the idea of functionalism. And so these are two different schools of thought, and they differed on how psychology should be approached. They differed on what they thought psychology should study. So structuralists, which include Wundt, would want to break down the mind and our cognition into the elementary components, into little building blocks. Whereas our functionalists, some of Wundt's other students and other individuals who came into the field, didn't really care about the individual building blocks, but cared more about the big picture. What's the function? What's the purpose of cognition? What's it doing? Not so much what elements are involved in doing it. And so each of these will get their own slides so we can talk about them in more detail. So for our structuralists, as the first of the established perspectives, we have Wundt and one of his students, Titchener. These structuralists, as I said, they wanted to study the mind, they wanted to study cognition in terms of basic elements. They wanted to understand the structural components, the individual pieces that fit together that allowed our minds or our consciousness to do whatever it was doing. And structuralism is always very strongly associated with the practice of introspection. And introspection just means to look within. So they would sit and introspect, they would look within to describe their own experiences. They focused on what they were sensing, the sensations that they were picking up, their feelings, and then they would describe them. And so they figured that these sensations would be the simplest and most basic elements of consciousness. So they would document whatever they were introspecting. And so as modern psychology students, we look at this and we say, okay, they had this idea of like scientifically breaking stuff down. They wanted to sort of document what they were feeling, and they wanted to do it sort of rigorously. But the act of introspection itself is very non-scientific. It kind of reminds us of that sitting around and thinking about thinking. And so that's where we kind of get that swing from the structuralists who had this one very structural, rigid way of doing it with a sort of fluffy approach. And then our functionalists came in and said, that's not what we should be focusing on. So the functionalists thought that the structuralists missed the point here. And so William James and James Angell, the two Jameses is how I remember these guys. They figured that psychology should be more about investigating the function or the purpose of consciousness. So they wanted to answer the question, what does the mind do? What is it capable of? They didn't really care about the little components that allowed it to do that. They cared about its capacity and what it was able to do. And this perspective was strongly influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. So they focused in a lot on adaptation. So If you think about, okay, so we have this mental capacity, we're able to do things. Maybe we're driven to do those things because it made us survive better. Maybe we remember where we put stuff because then we could put food somewhere and come back to it later. So those skills that allow us to survive and live longer would be called adaptations. And so those adaptations help us survive and reproduce. So they were trying to evaluate these different functions or purposes of the mind, the different aspects of our mental state that would have evolved because they were useful in helping us survive. And so if we have these two conflicting schools, you might ask, well, who won this battle? And the answer isn't as clear-cut as you might think. So in today's psychology field, we don't really break people down as either structuralists or functionalists. I've never seen anyone sort of relate to either of these because both fields had sort of useful aspects, but neither was completely right, or neither was entirely what we wanted to look at. So it was a good place to start, and then we moved on from there with stuff that we learned from both sides of the argument. So against structuralism, there was a lot of problems with that idea of introspection. Introspection and thinking about thinking and sort of musing on internal processes didn't really allow for an objective evaluation of a claim. You couldn't scientifically evaluate or measure or document what was going on. So even though they were originally pushing for a more scientific and rigorous approach, the way that they got there didn't quite get them there in the end. And then in contrast, functionalism kind of evolved and changed and can now be seen in the roots of some of modern psychology subfields. So things like applied psychology and behaviorism, which we will now get into, are actually considered direct descendants of functionalism because they're focusing in on sort of the purpose or what you're doing and that sort of thing. So neither is still predominantly featured, but the sort of heritage of both has continued within psychology. And so as promised, we can start talking about behaviorism. Behaviorism, as I said, is a direct connection from those British empiricists, that idea of gaining information and learning from interacting with your environment. And so behaviorism takes that almost a step further and emphasizes that the environment, the stimuli around you, are actually what control your behavior through learning. So as you interact with things in your environment, you learn about them. As a child, if you touch the stove and it's hot, it's going to hurt your hand and you learn not to touch the stove anymore. So behaviorism says that that avoidance of the stove came from learning and interacting with your environment. And this perspective, so if we think of this coming out of our structuralists and functionalists in that sort of timeline we have going on here, this is a radical reorientation because everybody else has cared about the structure or the function of the mind, and behaviorism is actually redefining psychology as we think of it. So a behaviorist would say that psychology isn't the study of behavior in the mind. A behaviorist would say that psychology is the scientific study of behavior alone. So we remove that mental side of things. And so this is why behaviorism is kind of that dramatic swing away from structuralism and functionalism, because they don't care about the brain. And for our famous figure here, we can talk about John B. Watson. And when he was proposing and starting to get behaviorism moving, they were really strongly opposed to that mentalism and focusing on cognition and the mind from earlier schools and earlier perspectives. They hated that focus on mentality and thinking and what's going on with the mind, and they chose to focus entirely on the body and our observable behavior. And from their definition, they even changed their perspective of behavior, because we included a little bit of wiggle room with our definition of behavior. we said that behavior was our both overt and some covert activities, so things that you do physically and externally, but also the stuff that goes on internally. But our behaviorists would exclude things like thoughts and emotions from their definition of behavior. A behaviorist would say that behavior is the physical stuff that you do, things that we can see and observe and record, and nothing else. So their perspective is that psychology focuses on observable behavior only and ignore unobservable inner consciousness. So that's a pretty dramatic swing from what we were just looking at. And in fact, we can take it one step further and look at radical behaviorism. And so this is an interesting one because it's, again, happened a lot more recently than I would have thought. But radical behaviorism said that the environment is the only controlling factor in terms of learning and behavior. So whereas a normal behaviorist would say that the mind is irrelevant, we're going to focus on how we interact and respond to our environment, a radical behaviorist would say that not only is the mind irrelevant, we're not going to consider it at all. It's not going to contribute. We're not going to consider it. It doesn't exist as far as we're concerned. So Skinner, throughout the 1900s, and he was quite prolific in terms of publications. We will talk a lot about Skinner as we get into the chapter on learning, and that's because Skinner was a strong proponent of what we now call behavior modification techniques. So when we talk about operant conditioning, we're going to talk a lot about Skinner. And the reason why Skinner was so tied up with these ideas of modifying behavior, especially using things in the environment, was pretty well illustrated with this quote, that no account of what is happening inside the human body, no matter how complete, will explain the origins of human behavior. Which is basically him saying that you could be able to describe absolutely everything going on in the brain and in the body, and it wouldn't help you understand or predict behavior at all. So he argued that humans are only reacting to their external stimuli and nothing else. There's nothing internal that matters. It's all about how we're reacting to what's external. So that's why it's a radical perspective. So radical behaviorism, because he took it that one step further. And as we get into that learning chapter, we'll talk about some of his proposals, which include things like saying that he could use operant conditioning alone to explain language acquisition in humans, which is quite the tall claim to make. All right, so our next couple of slides end up sort of tying in together. So I think what I'm going to do is I will call it here, just so I don't run long. And then that way we have enough to fill Friday's class as well, without having to go into chapter 2. So I will leave you guys at that point, and I will see you on Friday. And another reminder, because I always forget, Monday is a holiday, so don't come in on Monday. And I'm hoping if I say it out loud enough times, I won't come in on Monday.